Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Baskis, Club Relations and Membership Manager at Ontario Cycling. And tonight we are talking Safe Sport 101. This is the first of two sessions. The second session will be taking place on September 21st. I see a bunch of people who have already signed up for that. We will have a follow-up email after tonight's webinar with a link to the second one. So if you haven't signed up for that yet, you can't find the latest newsletter that has the link. Don't worry, it'll show up in your inbox within the next 24 to 48 hours. As we get started tonight, I do want to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar virtually from Ottawa, which is located on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to the time immemorial. I recognize the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. I honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory. And in addition, Ontario Cycling extends its deepest respect to all First Nations peoples, both past and present, as the custodians of the beautiful land that we reside on. A few housekeeping items as well. First, the webinar is being recorded tonight and will be made available in the coming days. I hope to have the link in the email that goes out to you. But as well, if anybody at your club, any members that you know, anybody who's in the cycling world that is not a member wants access, just simply have them give us a shout and we will make it available. Secondly, if you have any questions today, you can put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You can also click the chat button. And with a smaller group tonight, I do believe we have the ability to allow people to talk. So if you want to type in the chat that you want to actually verbally put your question out there, feel free and we will unmute your mic and you can share with everybody your question. As well, if you have any questions post-meeting, don't hesitate to reach out to either our office, Ontario Cycling, or to Sport Law if you have a question. Obviously, this is a very important topic within the sport landscape and cycling. So we want to make sure that there's no questions about what safe sport is. And we want to make sure that you have all the answers that you need. So with that, I want to introduce our two guest panelists for the webinar tonight. We have Will Russell and Kristen Noonan joining us from Sport Law. Will is a sport lawyer, having started his career in Halifax in 2014 and has experience in a wide range of practice areas, ranging from with a specific focus, on employment, advocacy, and government matters. Having joined Sport Law in 2021, Will helps clients navigate employment issues, manage investigations, elevates governance, and resolves disputes, and has a strong belief in working through conflict in an equitable manner that stays true to the organization's core values and respects people's dignities. Will grew up just around the corner from me here in Chelsea, Quebec. Has competed in numerous sports, including biathlon, soccer, sailing, basketball, and snowboarding, and has represented Canada at the Quebec at the Canada Games, and at nationals in rugby. I'm going to praise because in his profile it says winning multiple championships at the university and club level. So that's amazing, Will. Um, uh, He's also involved in several volunteer initiatives, including serving on the board of directors of the Canadian Progress Club in Halifax and acting as counsel at the Halifax Refugee Clinic and establishing a running and youth rugby program at his local rugby club. So I'm sure safe sport is an item that definitely comes across there. As well, Kristen Noonan has been involved in sport for over 30 years as an athlete, coach, parent, and administrator. And after transitioning from teaching in the national sports system over a decade ago, from teaching into the national sports system over a decade ago, Kristen has focused on athlete development and coaching and has become an expert in safe sport. With experience at the national sport level and the municipal level, Kristen provides expertise and support to many organizations in safe sport implementation through various workshops, presentations, education, and resources at all levels. For more than 6 years, Kristen has led the way in safe sport with her work at Softball Canada as the manager of their coaching, manager of coaching in safe sport, and focuses not just on education, but awareness and compliance at the national level and ensuring implementation of safe sport right down to the grassroots level. She sat on the Coaches Association of Canada's mandated safe sport training task force, helping create the safe sport training, which is currently available today. And her work has been featured multiple times for paving the way for creative, positive, safe, and accessible sporting environments. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Will and Kristen, and I'm going to let them take over for tonight.
Thank you, Chris and Pam, both for the introduction, maybe overly kind introduction, somewhat not exaggerating, so or emphasizing my athletic accomplishments, but also the opportunity to speak this evening. So this is a relatively small group. We are in the webinar format, but please do chime in with your questions in the chat. If you have something you'd like to talk about or unclear, because at the end of the day, this is for you who is attending. So please don't be shy. And if you're just like, I missed that, or what was that, Will? Can we go more into detail? Please do jump in. So I'm going to dive right into it. So what we're looking at today is sort of the initial part of this two-part series. It's really about fundamentals. So looking at some of the core pieces of Safe Sport, and then how we can go about establishing, both the policies, which is actually the easy part because that's a stroke of a pen, but then implementing them. And not only implementing them, but activating them. So that second part, and I will say the more important part, is going to be something that Kristen is going to be addressing in mid-September during the second session. So this is really about basics, establishing the foundation from them, and from there we can look to actually bring these into our clubs. So this is a little bit about us. We are sort of I refer to us as outhouse, in-house counsel for sport organizations. So all the needs of us that sports may require, both from a legal side, human resources, governance, but then also leadership and education. That's a little bit what sport law does. So that if there's something you have a question about in sport, we try to be able to help it. And it can go from random lease agreements all the way up to employment or dealing with safe sport policies and adjudicating them. So we'll start here. And this is really a two-part question, but what is safe sport? And why safe sport? So I don't know if anybody wants to hazard a guess or really talk about, what safe sport means to them. And Pam and Chris, you're included in that group if you want to weigh in about, from your perspective, what is safe sport? Kristen, you can weigh in too if you really want to.
I'll wait for someone else to answer first.
None of them are being very brave.
Sorry, you can type your answer in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you want us to unmute your mic and verbally give a response as well. Okay, so Ken wants to give us his answer. So, and then he went away. Ken, do you still want to give your answer? There we go. Perfect. I'm going to unmute you. Hopefully this works. There we go.
You gave, yeah, that.
Can you hear me okay?
We can. Perfect.
Excellent. Yeah, I have no idea what spaceport is, but my assumption is that given that I've broken a whole bunch of bones in various sports, it's safety in terms of interpersonal relationships and any kind of either peer relationships, hierarchical relationships, all that kind of stuff at a competitive or apparently a club level. How about that?
That's great. And it's Chris and I were having this conversation earlier today about the distinction between safety in sport and safe sport. And there's no clear dividing line. I think we can say some things are very much on the safety in sport, the rules of the game aspect of it, but that can also cross the line. We think of, not to pick on hockey, but, we think about the Marty McSorley and some of those incidents where a slash becomes a criminal act. So there are challenges there when it does cross the line, but that's a fantastic answer. Neil put in the chat the ability of all members, coaches, athletes to play and be safe. Again, I think that's a great answer. And for me, safe sport undersells what we're trying to accomplish and what this is really about. Because If any of us walked into a work environment for the first day and our manager said, hey, guess what? We have policies. You're safe here. I think we would probably think, I don't feel very safe right now. I think that's one of the challenges to suggest when we say safe sport, kind of that's kind of like the lowest common denominator. That's actually not what we're trying to accomplish. Yes, we want to have safe, we want people to be safe in sport, but it's more than that, right? It's just so and Kristen will go into some more detail of this, but I just want to make sure that like when we talk about safe sport, it's more than just safety, right? That's an important element, but that's not the be all and end all of this. And this is a point I always like to start off and emphasize. Safe sport is not another mechanism in the complaints process. Your code of conduct is not a means, a mechanism to address criminal behaviors, right? Like that, like criminal behaviors are criminal behaviors and they belong in that side of the justice system. Safe sport, the complaint process is an administrative process and it's not intended to cross that line. Certainly criminal behaviors are violations of our norms or code of conduct, but that's not its primary focus. That's not what we're looking to address. We have that mechanism through the courts to address it, and that's not the fundamental aspect of this. And I think we're really selling ourselves short if we say safe sport is focused on rooting out criminal behaviors in sport. They shouldn't be there, and if they are there, we need to make sure they're going through the appropriate mechanism. So, in answering the question of what is safe sport, I think it's important to look at why safe sport, and in many ways, this notion of safe sport has been a name has been put to it in the last 4 or 5 years. We think back to some of the other incidents that have come forward in the 80s and 90s, the Theo Fleury's and the like, about what some of the abuses in sport were, but we didn't really categorize or have it under the umbrella of safe sport. There really is a groundbreaking study that came out in 2019 that took a long-term view at national team athletes to look at what was affecting them and what had happened to them, what was their experience in sport. And it was one of the larger studies of this nature. And they thought the lens looked at what we traditionally view as different forms of abuse, and that was the presumption, or I think the working hypothesis going in was that abuse was going to be a major piece of the answers, and it wasn't. There were certainly concerns identified about abuse, but it was not the major area of this. It was much more of the psychological, the mental aspects of it, rather than those traditional physical or sexual assaults that people were experiencing. And it's these almost common practices. I'm old. I'm not that old, but I certainly remember instances of bag runs where we would run till we throw up, or in other activities which were commonly accepted in the 2000s. Just to be clear, it was in the 2000s that this was happening. That we're looking at that, we say, like, what is that doing? How is that making people feel comfortable? I won't put anyone else on the spot unless they want to volunteer of some of the practices that they've experienced in the past that would be unsafe, but it was these fundamental pieces that were saying, hold on a second. Yes, we do have a problem with criminal behaviors in sports and the power dynamics, and where we have gatekeepers who have been enabled and are able to keep their positions and do abuses. But there's also more of these fundamental aspects that we need to address. And that was, I think, really a shift in the thinking of this, is that what we're looking at, what we're dealing with, is way bigger than just a few bad actors committing criminal acts. There was these practices which were accepted that really shouldn't have been. And I think we look at any, if we could think sport as one silo, one category, I think we look at any professions, there's a certain amount of behaviors that are accepted because, well, that's what happened to me. That's what I went through. And to break that cycle and to really identify, like, hold on a second, why is this normal? Just because something has been normalized doesn't mean it's a normal or a good behavior. And so safe sport is really looking at this issue and going from looking at, so how do we make it better? What are the aspects that we need to get out of sport? How do we have a lens to have the conversations to make it so that everybody's safe, that everybody feels welcome, and going beyond the physical or the sexual assaults or maltreatments that I think a lot of us think of as being those problem areas. In many ways, speaking of Ontario, so you have Rowan's Law. In many ways, I view safe sport being about 5 years behind where we were with concussion safety. And I'm on the East Coast now, so Sidney Crosby, when he took a year off sports, that did a lot to normalize the impact of concussions on people. And I think we're still lagging a little bit on accepting safe sport and having these conversations. And so much of it is not meant to be a punitive aspect. What we're looking to do is have conversations to say, is that okay? And to work through it and not look to throw people out of sport for minor violations, but to understand some of the basic principles about, I know rule of two is a question that I get a lot because people are very afraid of it. And then to understand what are the fundamental principles under that rule of two in terms of open and observable that we're just trying to bring in for the protection of everybody involved. Christian's going to say, stop talking about my session very shortly. But that is something I think we just want to be doing. It's starting this conversation. Because at the end of, so if we, just because lawyers like definitions and I'm a lawyer by training, by practice, this is what, for me, one of the more comprehensive and basic definitions of safe sport is that emotional, physical, psychological, and emotional safety. And there's a line about whether or not we include safety in sport. I think Ken mentioned it. There is an inclusion of that, right? Like where, and that's it's a more challenging one where how do we understand and respect someone's barriers who said, I can't go on, and what's the difference between a violation of maybe pushing someone too far or just sort of working with them to succeed. And the ones that are more clear cut in terms of the harassment, the discrimination, and maltreatment. I like to have the definition here because the psychological safety is one that maybe we're just not as familiar. And it's really one where you're able to take risks, you're able to be yourself, you're able to speak up and feel like you're not going to be pushed down. Right? You have that confidence that you're able to risk and not be afraid of someone being punitive against you because you dared go against the norm or question things. And this is, so, and when we're looking at this and considering this, this venue or this discipline specific, I was curious to know from participants and Pam, Chris, weigh in on this, like what would we see as some safe sport issues that would maybe be unique or a little more arising out of your discipline, your activities? Is there anything that someone would just have an example that would say, hey, this is something could maybe have to work through and would maybe come up?
I think when we like you hit on rule of two, and I know that's something that's come up a fair bit because every discipline has different fields of play, different kind of venue situations. So a track cycling event would be easier to do open and observable because it's in contained facility. Whereas if you're on a mountain bike and you're out on a mountain bike trail, it's very difficult to do open and observable behavior while doing athlete training in that regards, as well as on the road. So there's that rule of two piece is quite challenging for coaches depending on what's happening. I think with anything, the coach-athlete relationship is challenging as well, and is always a risk for everybody. And we find that across all sports, right? That boundaries, and where are the boundaries? And I think when we have older athletes as opposed to younger athletes, those boundaries can get blurred.
Thanks for that. Neil's put a question in the chat. If the rule 2 can't be observed, should the ride be happening? Kristen, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. And really when we come down to best practices, especially when we talk about road or mountain, ideally, you aren't a coach or a person in authority with one athlete, right? Especially when you're going off in secluded areas. For me, that's a huge red flag. And it's not just for the participant or the athlete, it's for the coach or the manager, whoever's there. You don't want to put yourself in a vulnerable or compromising situation. So for me, that's an absolute no. If I can do that, have a second rider, have a second coach, have a volunteer, a person of authority with you on that ride. So yeah, for sure. That's if you can always have someone else there, that's what you want. And it's for yourself as much as it is for the athlete.
Thanks for that. And there's going to be challenges. Oh, there's some chat.
Just me. Just instructions.
Perfect. Just trying to keep track of everything. So there's a lot of challenges because, like, what happens if we're on a group ride and someone has a flat? What do we do? How do we do this? And I think sometimes we do need to make sure that we have the core principles considered, and then that's what we make sure we default to when we're trying to work through these issues, because we cannot consider and impose requirements for every conceivable situation that may arise in sport, right? There are too many variables, but we really do need to make sure, what are the principles here? What is that open and observable? In those situations where there is an emergency, harm reduction is always key, right? Like, I think of first aid, that yes, someone may have a broken neck, but if they're going to drown, we should probably get them out of the water first before worrying about whether or not we're going to, stabilize their neck. So having that opportunity to really make sure we have a good grasp of the principles and have our decision making informed by that is important. I like to include this. If anybody has a flight coming up, this is a good book, The Culture Code. Has anybody read it? Kristen, have you read it? I don't know. No. It's quite interesting because the author goes and speaks with high-performing cultures within organizations, sport organizations, as well as tech companies, military organizations, a huge range of different organizations, and tries to distill what are some of the key aspects that make these high-performance cultures operate, its functions, that they're safe. Trust is a huge part of it, that there is trust and confidence that people can speak up without being afraid, that psychological safety is very high within those environments. And at the end of the day, when we're going back in our clubs and we're engaging with this, the point of safe sport, the point of a safe sport policy suite is not to have your board consider, revise, amend, adopt policies, put them on your website, and then say, let's take our bikes and go home, right? Like, that's not what we're trying to accomplish here. It's an important part of it. We do need to have those pieces, but it's not the end of the story. And what we're trying to do is shift cultures and have the conversations in sport about what is or is not acceptable practices within our teams, within our clubs, within our competitions. And so I like this definition of culture because it's really fairly nebulous. I think we've heard culture in sport, culture in sport, culture in sport a little bit too much without actually understanding what that means. And for me, it's about, I like this definition. So it's living relationships and this working towards a shared goal. And if we were to look at, some friends who are data scientists who work in this in sport, and, they view policies as a data point. So it's just one aspect of our signal to our community, to our members, to our PSO or NSO about what our culture is. The fact that everybody in this call has made the effort to attend speaks to your culture and to your values. And so that's what I really like to make sure is that we're not just here, and I'm not here to advocate for just policies. I'm here to say, how do we make a comprehensive shift in how we do things? Neil, you have your hand up?
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just had a question. So the team that I work with is it's very diverse. There's male, female athletes, all different cultures in the background. How do we kind of go about like it hasn't happened, but I'm the team manager, director sportif for the team. In a situation where like a female athlete asked me, an adult female athlete asked me for a ride to a race, kind of how do I approach that? How do you go about that? We're both grown adults, kind of idea. Just wondering, like, you know, from as you said, my side as the director sportif, their side as the athlete. How do we kind of go about feeling safe or ground rules for something like that?
Well, I don't know, Christian, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, I think again, best case scenario is you have someone else with you. Now, we talk about this a lot when it's minor, so it's a little bit different where can you pick up another player? Can you pick up another coach? Is there another, adults? It's a little bit different when it's, two adult dynamics, but it's still the same thing that you are still in a position of authority, and you don't want to be, in a situation that could be perceived differently. So in an ideal world, you have another person in there with you, whether it's an athlete, whether it's a coach. But I know that's not always, it may not always be an option. But I do think that's where policy comes into place too. And I know Ontario Cycling does, follow open and observable and the rule of two. So that's something that I think really needs to be thought about. And if you can have that extra person or another way, I still think that's kind of the gold standard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we always need to look at the realities of sport weighed against the perfection. And there's always that in the construction side, there's as engineered and as built, or as designed and as built, and we do recognize that policies which are drafted on a computer, usually it's not raining and dealing with sport activities, are very different from the implementation. And we look at things like, what are the power dynamics? What are the different aspects of it? How can you have the communication? All these different things that can go into those situations. But Kristen's right. Ideally, it wouldn't be in place in that situation. But we recognize that we don't always work in the ideal. We work in the real. So, thank you for that. Yeah. So if you haven't, I don't get any proceeds from the sale of the book, but this is a good one for high performance culture and sort of different things that you can do. And they do really talk about psychological safety, and particularly some really good things from the San Antonio Spurs and what they've done there. So any questions right now, or do we want to keep pressing ahead? So the next little bit is just to situate some of this broader. So we've talked about this, what is safe sport, and then we're going to talk a little bit more of just where we are nationally, because I think it's important to situate ourselves within that broader conversation. So at the national level, since 2018, all nationally funded sport organizations have been required to have a third party as well for typically their national teams, their coaches, and things like that. So they've had required to have someone who will independently screen all those any complaints. They've also been required to have codes of conduct that address things like maltreatment. They've had been required to have training, different other things to have in place. And then within the last 18 months, they've been required to move to something called OSIC, so the Office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner, which is sort of the national level safe sport mechanism. And OSIC is still very much in its infancy. Someone described it as, building it, they're trying to sail a boat while building it at the same time. But it is, a very positive first step in terms of developing a standard that applies across the country and a mechanism that speaks to all sorts of different sports, because we've had fairly good process in terms of actually dealing with the adjudication, the arbitration of things. We haven't done very well in sport in terms of reporting, so going to someone who's independent, and also then the publication of it. So this is a start. OSIC applies the UCCMS, which is the Universal Code of Conduct to prevent and address maltreatment in sport. Yes, there are a number of letters missing from that acronym. It was not my decision. And the UCCMS is the national standard. It is the code, the conduct standard that's applied across sports. It includes aspects of maltreatment, so providing those definitions, other prohibited behaviors, as well as presumptive sanctions. So that is something that applies across the country to all national sport organizations are required to follow it and implement it increasingly, I would say. And it's always one of the questions about who is a participant or a member of a national organization that those standards are being imposed, are required to follow at the provincial and at the club level. So the UCCMS, I think we'll see, is going to be moving down through our sports sector from the high level national, the Olympic or tier, down through into the club level within the next 18 months. And it's certainly, there's a commitment at the Canada Games in February in Charlottetown from the provincial and territorial partners that there was going to be some form of third-party mechanism imposed in each province by the end of the year. I think they meant end of 2024, but anyway, we'll see how that goes. So that's just to situate ourselves. Now, to really get to the heart of this in terms of implementing safe sport, running a sport organization is an incredibly difficult job. Pam is like, well, you have very much undersold that description. And one of our challenges that I find we have the conversations is we always don't have time to take a pause and consider where we are and what we're doing. And one of the exercises that I like to do when we're going into an organization is to say, what do you think you should be doing? What do you think is best practice? And, I think we usually say, well, it's what Will talked about at the session last week. That's the best practice. And then we say, well, what do we have in place here? What are our policies? What do we say we're doing? What have we expressed publicly as this is what we're doing? And we have a conversation, we identify what we're doing, or we say we're doing. And then the third one is, what are we actually doing? Ideally, there's an alignment. This is best practice. We say we're doing it, and we're doing it. That's the ideal. I don't know if I've got there yet with the group as that being the initial piece or where they're at. But it really is important, because when we're talking about this issue of culture, when we're talking about this issue of safe sport, we really need to have an evaluation of, are our practices misaligned with what we say we should be doing in terms of our policies? And are our policies misaligned with what is the current and leading standard for what we should be doing? Does anybody, and I will not call on anybody, but would anybody like to say, well, we say we're doing this, but what we actually do in reality is different? Can anybody have an example of that? Everybody follows the leading standard and doesn't do anything different. I'll tell you. Oh, Neil, thank you for your bravery. We unmute Neil. There we go.
Hear me okay? So yeah, it's kind of I think for our club, I think we need to get a lot of stuff in place. I think a lot of the intent is there, but I think we need to get something down on paper and kind of roll it out to the members. So that way, there's a hard line drawn in the sand as kind of this is the accepted behavior, and just where to go and how to deal with certain situations.
No, and that's right. And I think that's great. And Kristen?
Yeah, I was going to say something too to that, because I know we work with a lot of sports at the national level or provincial territorial level, and I see it, at the local level. And because we've worked on their policies or done something, and then we've talked to coaches and they're like, I had no idea, or I didn't know that was a best practice. So I think some of that gap too is the policies are in place. Some of the best practices are in place, but they don't get into the hands of the people who are actually using it, right? And I see that's where there's sometimes a gap, or the different level in the water on your diagram.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, Neil, when you're looking at things and trying to come up with what you're doing in terms of your practices is a good place to start for drafting your policies, informed by these conversations and things like that. Because I had a conversation with this sport recently. I said, well, we can't do that. And I was like, why did you adopt it? They said, well, you sent it to us. I was like, yeah, but the whole conversation was, you have to have a conversation. What's your capacity? What can you do? And, screening, for example, is one that can be very difficult for smaller clubs to take on. And, we obviously have to comply with our statutory obligations and our obligation of our PSOs and the sport federation. But we do need to have consideration of what is our capacity funding. Volunteer hours are not an inexhaustible resources. I'm sure if I asked, you have so many of your volunteers are doing multiple roles already. And to look at and to say, I would rather you have a fairly basic process that you do really well, rather than the Cadillac that you just completely ignore. Right? Like, I think it's much more like, if you are able to do something well, it's better than everything poorly. And I think that's an important piece when we go through this, that, we talk about principles, we can say, this is the best. If you have a budget of $12 million and you can devote $1 million to it, how do we scale it? What are the core pieces? What are the pieces that we absolutely have to have? And what are the ones that we just say, you know what, we just don't have the capacity. So I think it is important that you don't lose sight of what you are doing and what you can do when we are going through, or if you're going through a policy development and implementation process. These are some of the basic questions that we're going through when you're going through this process. Is like, who are your people, right? Like for OSIC, for example, their people are the boards, the coaches, and the national team athletes. That's it, right? Doesn't really go down any further than that. 3 to 5% of participants in sport in the country. So who are your people, and when are they your people? Is it, if I get in a Chris and I get in a fist fight in the parking lot and we're both members of cycling, can we be tossed from the organization? Or I post something online, nothing to do with cycling, but it's pretty misogynistic. Can I be thrown out of the cycling community? So to have some clarity about who and when is really important. And there's massive areas of gray, right? Especially in this, I think the era of social media is maybe like the wrong title for it because it's kind of ubiquitous now, but like, our lives are not just lived within the confines of the walls of the place. Looking at that is a really important piece, and having an understanding of that. If you have an event and anybody walk through the gates, are they subject to your policies? If someone, and you can tell me if I'm way off base in terms of the sport, if someone throws something onto a track, is that a thing? Yes, no, yes. I think there could be a track, like at a velodrome. I'm not a huge cyclist. I will admit that now. But if someone interferes with the competition, and they are not a member of your organization, what mechanisms do you have to control that person, to say you're banned? So looking at these things of, who, when, and then what are those expectations are a really critical piece of being effective in developing your safe sport policies. If someone has a better example of wandering onto the track, let me know. This is, we're on the far right of this column right now into the policies and procedures, but there's so much, and we'll touch on this in a minute, but there's so much more in terms of being proactive rather than reactive. The policies and procedures really are for addressing issues after they've happened, but we don't want to reside in that world, right? Like, yes, it is going to be there, but that's not where we want to put our emphasis. We really need to be putting on our emphasis on the education, the discussion, what is and is not okay, and giving everybody the tools to address things before we end up with a person like myself going through, a more of a legal process. I put this out here just to maybe assure everybody that yes, if you're feeling a little bit confused about not knowing where to go, and that there's a lot of pieces and what's going on, so does most of us. It's a very, safe sport, because we're still very much in the infancy as a sports sector across the country. We're working this out. We're trying to sort through it. And I think it's where we come back to principles rather than, and our policies. But this is a tough issue, right? And I think we're trying to move ahead. Attending tonight's session is an important one. There are lots of resources, and it's really just trying to have an understanding and move forward, and just have good faith in what you're trying to do. And I think what we'll talk about in the next session is, this is not meant to trip anybody up, right? This is not meant to be gotcha. No, we're just trying to lay the foundation to be, to provide practices and to guide our decision making, so that we're making sport better for everybody. This is just, one example of a roadmap. It's not your roadmap, but certainly for those participating at the national level, this is what you would be seeing in terms of the complaint process, where both the identity of the individual and the nature of the complaint involved can decide where you go. And that's true of NSOs and also PTSOs, that there is a differentiation about what are the type of complaints and where they go. So it's one that, it's important that you need to be able to articulate your pathway. If you can't articulate your pathway, that can be a really big problem. So you really do need to make sure that you, if you are tasked with that responsibility in your club, that you're able to go back and say, this is how we deal with different types of complaints. Because not everything is a safe sport complaint, right? That if you disagree with the decision at the board level, that's a governance one. Deal with it at your AGM if you need to vote people out. That not everything does reside in safe sport. And I think it's important that we recognize that it is not every type of dispute, every type of disagreement results in a safe sport complaint. And I think the education piece, and Kristen will go, is that there's inherent conflict in sport, because someone wins, someone does not win. And there are looking for angles, looking for advantages, and those can result in heated moments, and that we're able to navigate those pieces without everything becoming the need for a formal adjudication or formal process. Also, a big part of finding sport is that there is no degrees of separation, that everybody has known each other for 30 years and has long and deep, long-standing minor feuds about 1984 when they got cut off and cost them the high school championships. And when we're looking at this, important piece when we're having the conversation is the scope. And this is really important, because we are not trying to solve everything for everybody at all times. So to really have an understanding, what are the activities? Is it your practices? Like when does this apply? Your events. If you have a meet, if you have a competition, does it apply? Is it time-based? Is it event-based? And then also classification. Like, there are national team athletes or even provincial team athletes that may reside and have a more strict adherence to your policies than someone who shows up once every second week for a club ride. And so having that understanding really can help educate your members on what you're trying to do with Safe Sport and when it applies, and go from there. I know I have been sort of forging ahead, so if people do have questions, please stop me talking and interrupt. These are some of the key pieces as a sports sector that we are trying to work through. Looking at the different jurisdictions, who has this issue? If you're at a Canada Games, is it a PSO issue? Is it a Canada Games issue? Who should be dealing with it? Getting consent. So when people register, Pam, I guess this is probably a question I should know, but do people register with your individual clubs? Do they register with the NSO? Do they register with the PSO? And in doing so, do you have to click a box, or do you actually have to read something that says, I have reviewed our code of conduct, I have reviewed our whatever policies, and I agree to follow them? And I can tell you, I had one last week when I went to sign up where it was a timer that I wasn't allowed to scroll to the bottom quickly and click OK. It actually had a 90-second timer before I could click OK. Because otherwise, we've all been on iTunes and none of us have read that. And we don't want that to be. And we do try to, when we work with folks, to put in plain language, things that people can understand, because this isn't meant to be performative. This isn't meant to be a box that you check at the beginning of the year to say, I agree, and then you forget about it completely. The reporting mechanism, so that pathway, how it works out, where you go, when you go, looking at, issues of child protection, the overlap with our statutory obligations, human rights, things like that, employment, these are all pieces we need to keep in mind as a sector. The national and the provincial alignment, that's a challenging piece right now. One of the big advantages of the OSIC process is that if I'm suspended or found to be ineligible from badminton, all other sports who are OSIC signatories are required to recognize and honor that suspension. So we have more of a horizontal integration of sanctions to protect sports, across disciplines, not just at the national and provincial and club level. So that's a piece that we're working through, as well as the publication of decisions and sanctions. How are they published? Where are they published? Who holds them? Who knows about them? Things like that. So as these are all very high level. If someone feels like that's a lot, you probably are not going to solve them at your club level. And if you do, please call me. I would love to hear your solutions to it. But these are some of the different elements that we are looking at as a sector that we don't have any clarity to, that we're trying to work through. So, and just to come back to Ontario, looking at Section 125 of your child protection, what is the duty to report? What is a reasonable apprehension of harm that triggers an obligation to report potentially through your Safe Sport mechanism, but then also to call the authorities if you think that there's a youth in need of protection. So there is a lot, and I think there is important that we just have an awareness so that if something does come up, you say, hold on a second, I need to call Pam or Kristen or Chris. Do we have any questions? Or we got into the last part of our section, or our last part of tonight's discussion? No? Nothing's popping up, so I'll keep moving ahead. I touched on this already. Safe Sport can be very expensive. If you have Safe Sport complaints, they can be tens of thousands of dollars very, very easily. And it is necessary sometimes that we go through this, that sometimes it is unavoidable. But a lot of what we deal with, if we increase our education, what Safe Sport is and what it is not, that's money that's well spent. And I think we can prevent a lot of issues if we arm people with the tools to understand what we want to be happening in a Safe Sport environment. Question I have, what is your legal authority for setting policies that are binding on athletes and coaches? So at the end of the day, associations like sport organizations are contractually based. You have a membership who agrees to participate in activities. A organization agrees to provide certain benefits to its members, and that it's a contract, and so those policies that are binding on athletes and coaches is very much grounded in that fundamental relationship of a voluntary association like a sport organization. Does that address it? To get more precise, typically it's in your bylaws. Your bylaws, as a general rule, will say, here are our members, here are our registrants. The board may, from time to time, implement such policies and procedures for conduct and discipline as it deems necessary and appropriate, as amended and voted on by the board, or something to that effect. Does that answer the question? I didn't see the name attached to it.
I believe it was an anonymous submission.
Okay. Correct. There's no statutory authority that I'm aware of to say that these safe sport policies must be implemented. There are certain quasi-constitutional or legislation that we cannot contract out of. Occupational health and safety, human rights legislation, the ESA in Ontario, Child Youth and Protection Act. There are pieces of legislation that there are some overlap that we cannot contract out of, but so many of those try to address, I would say almost more like the bare minimums rather than setting what we want to be doing. Like, we don't want to be saying our organization should be operating down here. We want to be setting the bar up here. And yes, statutory authorities, yes, not violating the Human Rights Code is an important piece of being a functioning organization. But what we're trying to look to do with Safe Sport is really elevate it beyond that. Richard, is that a question for me, or is it a question for the sport organizations? The question was, how are you funded? I don't know if we can unmute Richard and how is Safe Sport funded? It's through it's often through your membership dues. It's a service. It's a work that you're providing to your members. No different than if you had to provide a technical committee to set the standards for competitions.
Yeah, so part of our budget, we do have a line for legal. So if there is a complaint that comes through and we have to hire a case manager, an investigator, or we have to go to a discipline panel, that all comes out of our budget. So that is something that we as the PSO has to pay for, just like it's something that the NSO has to pay for if it goes to the NSO and through OSIC. So that funding is actually something we're responsible for. So when we get those claims, they, as Will said, they can go tens of thousands of dollars. I know of ones that have gone a lot higher. So it's scary. And that's why we want these best practices in place. And so we have those policies that we can actually show up and say, this is the expected behavior. And these are the consequences for not addressing or following the expected behavior.
Oh, Neil's hand is up. Go ahead, Neil.
There we go. I was wondering, so we're registered as a trade team in Canada, and we purchase insurance that deals with lawsuits. Basically, it doesn't cover much. I thought it would cover like accidents that would happen to team members driving cars down in the caravan and stuff like that. It doesn't cover that. What it covers is lawsuits and stuff like that. Have you heard of something like that? And basically, from reading it over, what I got out of it is, if there was a lawsuit against anybody in the team, that's what this insurance would cover.
Yeah. So that would be a more standard piece of insurance. I can tell you that last year, when the insurance companies were pulled before Parliament to testify for whether or not they provided coverage for Hockey Canada's some challenges there, the insurance companies very quickly got out of the business of providing any form of coverage for abuse or sexual abuse. So it is incredibly expensive to purchase. What's a little bit more normal is you'll see oftentimes you'll have for litigation involving both what you're referring to, like the car accidents. Sometimes you'll find things for wrongful termination, the employment side, but the coverage for safe sport is almost impossible to find in terms of an insurance premium. So there are different sports who are looking to take different approaches. Sometimes you're saying we're going to charge an extra $2 per registrant, and we're going to bank it and have that as a line item and draw down on it when we have a complaint. So maybe to specifically answer your question, that's not unusual for it to be very limited and to sort of really cover off, death and an injury from a vehicle or from an event, but it's pretty rare to have any kind of coverage for safe sport these days.
Okay, definitely something worth digging more into.
I will say, for those serving on boards and things like that, like you will have the defense costs, your directors and officers liability, like will typically cover the individual, like the organization may have to, but like personal liability for organizational behaviors is still very, very challenging. Right? Piercing that corporate veil, they would call it, is something that's very, very challenging. And the actions have to be extraordinarily egregious, or at least quite egregious, to sort of look at that attracting personal liability.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. So looking at this, I've already mentioned that implementing policies is not sort of an opportunity to go home and say your work is done, but also, once you brought them in, you really do need to look, and Kristen can talk more about the activation side of it, is just to look at and to have an evaluation of how we're doing. Are we actually addressing situations that arise in our discipline and our events that target to our participants? And that you don't just plunk it down, say the paper's there, and move on. The example I always, there's a study, I think it was the First World War, about where to armor planes that were coming home, and in the World War, and they looked at where the planes that survived had holes in them. They said, well, we should put armor there. And a mathematician said, no. The planes that aren't coming back are the ones that had holes in the place that struck a vital system. So I think that's something we always want to be stress testing our process, stress testing our standards to say, are we missing something? Where do we have blind spot? Where do we have a bias that we're not actually accurately capturing the data, and maybe that we've overlooked something? So it's always a process for all of our things to make sure we look at where are the gaps. So the analysis, so like, where do we stand? What evidence do we have? Does our community understand these principles? Do they, when you say safe sport, do we just get blank looks? Or what is the basis? Where's our baseline for all of this? And then once we have that, how are we going to roll this out? It's not just something that we can trust people to read, because no one has read the terms and conditions of iTunes. And I would say that people also haven't read the terms and conditions of their policies. And I will admit, I played rugby for a very long time, and I did not ever read any of the code of conduct throughout the 18 years that I played this sport. So it's a challenge, because these aren't meant to be performative things that just sort of sit on the shelf that are taken down when there's something that hits the media. So what are those, what is the communication? What is the engagement plan? How do we have the conversation with the parents? if we do have youth athletes and minors, how do we communicate this to them so they understand this notion of safe sport? How come we can't text? How come my child can't text you? Why? Like, I don't want to get bombarded with more text because you're saying you cannot text me directly. Christian, you may have more better examples, but that's a very realistic situation where people say, like, why is it that we can't have a communications one-on-one between our child and the coach? We used to do it before. That's the way we've always done it. And just, because that doesn't align with open and zero, because it's an opportunity for challenging situations to rise. So to make sure that we are providing education both to our participants, but also people on the peripheries, especially in the youth area. This implementation, I may have emphasized the communication piece a little bit too much, but it is an absolutely essential part of all of this because we have so many good policies and procedures out there we just don't have the engagement with. My part of the work is the easy part because it's usually on a pretty clear timeline. And it's a pretty static thing. We draft policies, we have a conversation with the board or with staff, we revise, we edit, and we publish. But that is just 5% of the work in terms of actually making spaces that are safe and comfortable for people to compete in. So implementation and communication, I cannot emphasize them enough in terms of their importance. If we're looking at our plans, like how do we communicate internally? And this, again, adjust for the size of your organization and for the club. Do we have things of, communicating internally and externally, so that people has an understanding of the core principles going forward. And then once we've moved to that implementation, how are we actually gauging? Are we successful in this? When we're speaking, I had a conversation with someone said, we don't have a problem. We have never had a complaint in 25 years. No one has ever come forward to the board and said, I feel unsafe or I have a problem within the sport. They were really proud of that statement. Having known people for as long as it's been alive, where there are people, you're going to have disputes. You're going to have challenges. So to suggest that you do not have problems because you do not have complaints, it is inaccurate. So if that does happen, are people happy? What is our culture? Are there concerns? And so to make sure that we are able to also go out of our normal basis for who we would consult is really an important piece of this. And make sure that people feel comfortable reporting and having conversations, because it's asking people to be really vulnerable if they're saying, this is why I don't feel comfortable. And this is really, what you're trying to ask. Like, do you think that your people understand what is expected of them? Who here thinks that on a technical side, their people understand their policies and their practices? Anybody? No one? It's a good exercise to have the conversation to gauge where everybody is at. And sometimes the difference is people who understand them and people who think they understand them. There's also a gap there. But this is a really important piece because you've heard me say this once, I'll say it again. This is not just meant to be a performative thing, a nicety that we put, and it's a check mark and we're done. So this is our sort of, we have enough data and we certainly work with enough organizations to really have a sense of when organizations are getting in trouble. If they don't have some form of rules. And you're not trying to capture everything, but have some form of broad overarching procedures and standards that people have to follow. And they're clear and they're understood and they're linear, that you can trace them, and they're not just sort of all over the place in a bit of a scattergun approach. And then if you do have something, and this goes to my point earlier, if you do have something, that you follow them. Because if you have something, you say, this is what we do, but you don't follow it, that's even more confusing for folks to understand what should be done. And also if you do have rules, that you consider your capacity, that you consider the nature of your organization, because you don't just copy and paste and you bring in rules that were tailored for the Ontario Hockey League into your 74-person club. And this happens more than I would like, that you send your lawyer copy of your policies because something happens, and he says, why is there a reference to ringette throughout your curling policies? And why is it referred to, Yukon Curling Club? So, just to look and make sure that if you are going out, and there are some fantastic resources available, but really do make sure that you're taking it from a trusted source. I would suggest that we would look to use the resources from your home PSO, because I think am I still there? Yes, no? Okay. There are those comprehensive resources available to you, and that you're able to bring them in rather than go sort of to consult Google, because sometimes you can be led astray by Google.
I just wanted to reiterate, I think it's when you bring up the, policy of one sport, not, referencing another sport or whatnot, I think it's safe to say that if you are at a board level or a director level and you don't take the time to review your own policy for what you think you can do or what's in there, then there's no way you should expect or can expect your members are going to pay attention to it. Like, you have to kind of lead by example. And I know that just coming from other sports, the biggest issue that I've always seen when it comes to policies is just, very much the board kind of takes a policy, puts it in place, but it's never really communicated out to the members. So it just kind of dies at the 8 people at the table. And then it's like, okay, well, I didn't know what the policy was when something finally comes up. So it's definitely make sure that you're communicating your policies out to your members. And that, as Will put, you're reviewing your policies constantly. So
that was one time I was like, that was really it. And I think for me, that we're looking at this in terms of some of the key takeaways is the principles.
Will, you sound like a robot.
Yeah. Not great. Your screen's doing what it did before. Maybe stop sharing and then see what it does, and then come back, and hopefully we won't lose you.
Internet World Nova Scotia is not great.
No. We can make out slightly what you're saying, but it's very choppy.
He's now run away again.
Yeah, he's going to jump off and come back. It worked last time.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions while we wait for Will to jump back on? I know it's a lot to take on. Oh, there's Will. That was quick.
I'm hoping, am I any better?
Yes, much better. Yeah.
Blame it on the storm outside and the rural internet. So really just wrap this up. We didn't go into sort of the specifics of the UCCMS and what is maltreatment and what is not maltreatment, because one, I think that more resides with Kristen, so she's gonna have to do the heavy lifting on that. But also, so much of what we have so many good materials available, but we just miss the actual conversation of how we can get from the ideal to the implementation. And I hope we've said here is sort of some of those pieces and why we should be doing it and how we should be doing it. Because you know, the conduct standards are quite simple. Getting people to follow them is the hard part and the important part. So for me, you know, if a key takeaways, it's really that, you know, the education, the alignment in culture, are the vital aspects of this as an organization to sort of establish those foundations that we can be successful. So we have a few minutes left if the internet here allows me to stay online. Are there any questions, you know, about anything tangentially related to this issue of safe sport?
Or everybody just wants to percolate on all the information and then they'll come back with some questions.
And we will be sending out a copy of the slideshow as a PDF. Yeah, like, I don't know, Pam, if you have anything that we missed or maybe we could talk about for the last few minutes.
Not really. I think the big thing is that we do have policies, so you guys don't have to go out to other sports. You don't have to try and borrow them off of Google. Don't do that. We've paid and done the heavy lifting on that. All our policies have been vetted by legal counsel. But again, like, I think it is really important, and I really like, Will, that you made the point of don't put policies in place that you can't implement or follow through on. And that's a difficult one. So the policies that we have as a PTSO may not be enforceable at the club level just because of the level that we're dealing at and what we're looking at. So using ours as guidelines and looking at those base behaviors, or even with our discipline and complaints or our code of conduct, we do have a section on spectators for code of conduct and expected behavior on spectators at events. And we make our photographers, even that we've hired at events, sign waivers so that they know that if they interfere with the event, they can be sued and it's on them. So it's things like that where we're looking at those expected behaviors, and what we're enforcing as a PTSO may not be what you're looking for at a club or even at a trade team level, right? Like, so it's exactly as Will's pointed out, is what is the application, what is it you're delivering, and what are you doing as a club or a team? Neil, is there anything out there explaining? Yes, there is quite a lot actually about the Universal Code of Conduct, like, about what it is, and there's a number of articles.
Yeah, OSIC has published, so the Office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner has published a annotated version of the UCCMS, which is a good version.
Yeah.
There's a number of other ones out there, but so that's sort of the authoritative version. You know, we are on UCCMS version 6.0.
Yes, there was quite a few versions.
And it's been around for 3 years.
Yes.
Yes, and Neil, I will make sure that I include it in the slide deck when it goes out. I'll include that annotated resource. You know, some sports are mandating different education platforms. So that are you know, asynchronous, that are provided by CAC. I think CAC is generally available. Respect in Sport.
Respect in Sport. CCES, I think, has something. Yes, or they did.
They did. I know OSIC is.
They're looking at something, yeah. But the CAC one, for anyone who hasn't taken it, is free, and it's 90 minutes. Online, it's a great intro. There's a lot of really good videos and interactions with that will really kind of give you some solid examples from real experiences.
I just put in the chat again a link to the UCCMS. It has both the full version and the annotated version as well on the page. So it says version 1.0, but when you click on it, it actually goes to 6.0. So it looks like
we'll have another one next year too.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, for just to be clear, for the UCCMS, it only covers certain types of behaviors. So I think it is an important piece, and it does capture the spectrum of criminal behaviors is in all the way through maltreatment, but there are a number of other behaviors that are not captured within it or not clearly captured within it. So, things like social media policies can be an important one because yes, making psychologically abusing someone on social media can happen, but sometimes we want to have more clarity on what that actually means. And so UCCMS, someone will say, well, we'll just adopt it as our code of conduct. That will not be sufficient. Right? It covers, it is very comprehensive, but there are some intentional gaps that you will have in that, particularly on the issues of doping, field of play issues, and things like that. Thank you, everybody, for your attention. I really do appreciate it. I know we're on the East Coast, so it's a little bit later here. Pam, Kristen, sorry, any sort of last points you'd like to, before we wrap up?
Well, I think that's great. And I think for those who are on tonight, like we'll set such a strong foundation. And then if you're joining us on the 21st, we're going to take a lot of these little pieces and see what they look like on the ground. So, we will talk more about the rule of two. We'll talk about the electronic communication between a person in authority and an athlete. We'll talk about travel. We're going to have some safe sport tips for coaches, for athletes, parents. We're going to talk a little bit about the reporting, training, education. We're really going to kind of take all of this and say, what does it look like for you, either as a club or as a coach or as an athlete on the ground? And how do we just take these little tangible pieces and put it into play? Because sometimes it can feel overwhelming, but it can be simple little things that you're like, oh, this is just everyday practice, right? And it's those little things that add up and make that positive and safe environment. So that's what we're going to kind of flip the switch to on the next session and talk about kind of on the ground, what does it look like? So
if anybody has any questions leading into that you want to flip in advance, definitely feel free. I'll definitely make sure that Will and Kristen get those so that they can ensure that any question is addressed. I'm sure it probably will be, but sometimes specific questions relating to your club or your circumstance are important to focus on a little bit more. So yeah.
We love those type of questions. So please do send those along, because the more specific we can be to your challenges and your discipline, your activities, the better. And we'd really like that to be of as maximum benefit as we can to everybody.
Yep. And as always, you can email Chris or myself any of your questions, concerns.
Okay. Well, that's it for me.
Yeah,
thank you again.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Kristen, for joining us tonight. And we will definitely see you guys on September 21st. And yeah, if anybody else has a question, don't hesitate to reach out to our office. We're the OC staff is there for you. So don't be shy. I've probably talked to almost everybody in this room at some point, maybe even in the last couple of weeks. So that's a good thing. But yeah, we definitely want to make sure that everybody feels like these are informative, that they're useful, and that they can take them back to their club or their members or friends or whatever, and ensure that they understand what's going on as well. So we will upgrade Will's internet for the next one.
The high speed, December of this year. December of this year, they'll have fiber optic. So.
Well, thank you so much, Will and Kristen, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. We'll send out a link to the recording as well as the slides and other pieces as we get them.